Media Melanie Talks TV. I'm Melanie, and today I'm back to talk about a brand new true crime series on Paramount+. It's called Happy Face, and it stars Annaleigh Ashford, who I most recently watched in Chippendales on Hulu, and it also stars Dennis Quaid as the titled serial killer, the Happy Face Killer. Now, this series is actually based on two existing pieces of IP. The 2009 novel by Melissa Moore Jespersen herself, titled Shattered Silence, The Untold Story of a Serial Killer's Daughter, which later launched into the podcast Happy Face. Which raises the most important question that I plan on getting into with this reaction and review is, because we've already got this story told on two other mediums, do we actually need a full 8-episode TV show? Today's reaction and review will cover the first one, called The Confession, and the second one, called Killing Shame. And I will continue to ask this question, do we actually need this TV show, or could it have potentially actually worked better as a movie? Now, I've only watched the first two, and it's strange because the pacing felt like a slow burn, but also some things escalated faster than expected. So I'm going to get into that, the story, the characters, and how this approach for a true crime series is slightly different than other ones that we're used to seeing, such as Ryan Murphy's Monster over on Netflix, and other more graphic depictions of these true crime stories. Before we get more into it though, please go ahead, like this video and hit that subscribe button, especially if you enjoy videos where I talk about TV shows such as this. I am also covering the Severance on Apple TV Plus finale, which airs tomorrow, so don't miss that, along with The White Lotus on HBO Max. If there are any other TV shows that spark your interest upcoming this year, definitely drop a comment and let me know, and I will take them into consideration. I'm still finalizing my coverage schedule. Lots of great TV this year though, so either way, stick with me for more TV talk. All right, let's get into my initial reactions. First, the title theme. I love it. It is by Jenny Lewis and the Watson twins. It's called Happy, and it is moody. It's a little dark and creepy. It really fits this show well, and I'm always a sucker for a quality title theme. Now, I'm curious to know for everybody else who's watching this, are you familiar with the case? Did you dive into the book? Did you listen to the podcast? I decided to approach this as a blank slate. I want to be surprised. I want to let the mystery build and see where this case takes us. That said, after these first two episodes, it does feel like a little bit more of a slow burn. And again, could this have worked better as a movie? Potentially. I won't know the full answer to that until I finish the season, but so far it does seem like could have maybe been a movie. Now, we do see this trend where there are all of these slow burn series that could potentially work better on the big screen. However, are these productions thinking, well, you know what, we can actually get more ad revenue as a TV show versus a movie? And is that the strategy with creating some of these series? Again, there are 8 episodes this season. I'm going to cover the first 2 here. They're each about an hour long. They drop on Thursdays. So we are going to let the momentum build. Now, this could actually be one that maybe even worked better as an all-at-once drop, and I'm usually the first person to say no. I'm against the binge. It's hard to keep up. There's this pressure to watch, but some shows do work better as that, whereas you're waiting week to week, and maybe if the buildup is not quite as significant as one would hope, you might lose interest. I will say after watching these first 2, I am tempted to go out and look more into the case to see what we can expect and really how beefy it is, to see if in fact the pacing is going to be this slow, or if there is so much to this case to explore that it fully justifies 8 episodes. Also, just a quick note for my school spirits friends, we do get to see Mr. Anderson, Patrick Gilmore. He plays a bartender. We first meet him in episode 2. IMDb does show he is in 3 episodes, although IMDb is not always correct. In fact, oftentimes it is wrong. But either way, we get to see a familiar face here, and I love it when they have these cast crossovers on the same streaming services. So episode 1, called The Confession, essentially Melissa's daughter receives this birthday card in the mail with a very strange drawing, and it's from her mom, Melissa's estranged father, Keith Jespersen. He's reaching out after all these years, and he has sent her letters that it appears she's never opened and read, but she immediately has this visceral reaction like, no, don't read that, it's from this other uncle, and there's a picture of this nice Chilliwack location where her daughter Hazel is like, hey, why don't we take a camping trip there? And Melissa's like, oh no, absolutely not. So Melissa works as a hair and makeup artist for a TV show, The Dr. Greg Show. Not only does her estranged father, who is the happy face killer, reach out to her daughter at their home, but he also calls her work and lets them know, you know what? I killed 8 victims, but I withheld 1. There is actually a 9th. So we initially get this big mystery. Who is the 9th victim going to be? Melissa actually thinks he's lying, but once her and her producer Ivy actually go to investigate, they learn that in fact, yes, there is a 9th victim out there. And we actually learn who it is pretty fast, which was surprising to me. I was thinking, okay, maybe this is a bigger part of the mystery. They had to build up more to determine who the victim is. But now that we know who it is, it seems like we will have a reverse engineering situation where they will work backwards with the clues that were given. There are also a significant amount of flashbacks within these first 2 episodes that help us see more into the context of Melissa's experience as the daughter of a serial killer and the impact as a 15-year-old learning who your father really is. Now, this is a secret she's kept from the public and her kids for years. Nobody at the Dr. Greg Show had any inclination that she was in fact the daughter of the happy face killer until she is called in and ends up outing herself. But something about how fast she does come out as the daughter of the serial killer publicly seemed like a pretty quick 180 to me. For someone who kept this big secret for years, she changed her mind pretty fast, and before we know it, she's literally on the show she works for telling her story. So I'm curious to know why some of the pacing seems a little slower, but at the same time, we're escalating certain things very fast. Which brings me to the next point that does create a bit of a sense of urgency here. After we learn who the victim is, this is where it does get interesting because it turns out there's actually somebody else in jail, not only imprisoned, but also on death row with 2 months to live. Obviously, this person was falsely accused of the crime, but we're introduced with a situation where the police, the DA, everybody who investigated this years ago doesn't want to be wrong, doesn't want to look bad. It's a bunch of old white men who didn't get it right, and nobody wants to admit their mistake or shine a light on a police department where, maybe they didn't even have the right necessary evidence to convict this person. So part of this is also working to reopen the case, investigate, see what her father's actual role was in this killing. We learn this victim is a woman named Heather from Texas and that her dad did pick her up as a hitchhiker. We eventually come to find these clues, a yellow guitar pick from a bar that she worked at in Texas, where we end up meeting our friend, Mr. Anderson from School Spirits, as I mentioned earlier. But something early on when Melissa had gone into her safe and pulled out this little box of trinkets and she dumped them out. Before it was actually revealed that some of these trinkets were given to her by her dad, I'm thinking, oh yeah, these are very much serial killer trophies. How creepy though, her dad gives her some of this stuff. I mean, imagine having a father as a serial killer, and that's really the biggest premise of this show. The ripple effect for the family members, how that trauma impacts people. And it impacts everybody differently. We had Melissa keeping this as a secret. Now she's out there on a TV show talking about it. I don't know that her husband was very supportive of that. Of course, he was in the audience. But then her daughter, Hazel, she starts getting bullied at school, which we also see in flashbacks is repeating the cycle of her mother, Melissa, getting bullied. But it turns out a little bit differently because Hazel ends up meeting these girls who dub themselves murderinos. That's a term I've never heard before. I know all about true crime enthusiasts. I've always been fascinated with that myself. Murderino, that is a new word for me. As it happens, there's this murder museum in Seattle where Hazel does go to visit with these 2 girls that were previously bullying her, but are now kind of fascinated with the fact that, yeah, her grandfather is a serial killer. And Hazel's pretty fascinated with it as well. I mean, imagine all of a sudden learning this big secret as to who you really are or who your family really is. And again, that is the main premise of the show. I read an article in the LA Times from the showrunner, and she talks about how her goal in doing this is to actually differentiate itself a little bit more from other true crime series and get away from these tropes of showing violence against women, naked bodies strewn about, but instead explore the complex themes of these ripple effects and how families are affected and impacted, and really tell it from that perspective instead of a shock value type of situation that we see more in a Ryan Murphy monster Netflix type of series. But my question is, will that perspective be enough to keep our interest? I think a lot of true crime people actually kind of enjoy the graphic nature and seeing all of these horrific things because it's so hard to relate to as people who are not criminals. So will not seeing that and just relying heavily on the storytelling itself be enough to keep all of these true crime fans interested? Because when I see a series about true crime, I do have certain expectations. So I'm interested to see if me as a true crime fan, I wouldn't call myself a murderino, but as someone who does watch true crime things, see if I can be entertained enough to stick with it for the entire 8 episodes. I think one thing that is interesting when they do travel to Texas, they are kind of doing these reenactments, creating B-roll for the TV show, the Dr. Greg show, where they will showcase this story. I think that's interesting. I've worked in TV production, so I always appreciate the behind the scenes stuff. We did actually see a dead body, although it turns out it was just an actress playing one. And interestingly, Melissa is there touching up the tattoo. So kind of fun to see these behind the scenes, if you will, of the production of a true crime story that will be told on television, which is kind of meta given that we are watching a true crime story on television, as it also plays out in a talk show format on our screens. I do think this does a good job setting the table of showing how a family can completely be upended by crazy news like this, and also asking the question, as Dr. Greg does to Melissa, do you see any of this terrible monster person inside of yourself? And that introspective and questioning yourself when you know you are the flesh and blood of a literal monster, that's gonna weigh heavily on a person. And watching the emotional, visceral reaction that she does have on the television show does have some impact. I just think for me, one of the most difficult parts is how fast Melissa's turnaround time was from keeping this deep, dark secret to then appearing on a national talk show. It happened so fast. I would think if this really was a deep-seated trauma, it might take a little bit more prodding in order to accept that and then go public after so long. However, there is also some sense of urgency that they've created because there is somebody sitting on death row for this crime who should not be convicted and who obviously should not be put to death. And again, I haven't read this case, so I don't know if they're able to successfully investigate, get her dad, Keith Jesperson, found guilty of this crime, or is a man actually wrongly executed? Now that would be pretty crazy. Please do not spoil it for me down in the comments. I will not spoil it for you if for some reason I do end up reading ahead in the case, because we are here to watch this show unfold. It is a TV show. It's not a movie, despite me thinking that it could perhaps work better as that, or as I mentioned, a full season drop at once, because I don't know if the story is going to be strong enough to really keep us coming back every week. That said, of course, I will be here for the 3rd episode, and we'll probably continue covering it. I'll keep you posted, but I'm curious about your initial reactions. Do you feel the same way, or do you feel that there is adequate building of this story to justify this full 8 episodes? Now, something I do like about this perspective of it being from the actual family and seemingly having the support of the other family who obviously wants their family member out of jail because they did not commit this crime is it does feel a little bit less exploitative. Whereas some of these true crime series, the families are adamantly against them being put on television and having their stories told because it's hard. With the media and the way people react to things, I mean, we see bullying here and that being one of the fallouts from the public knowing who you're related to. But also perhaps it could be a way to build more relatability in general. The showrunner had also said her dad was actually in jail for drug dealing, and this really appealed to her just as a family member of a criminal in general, not even necessarily a murderer. In fact, the showrunner was working on the Netflix series Your Honor, heard the podcast in the car and called her agent and was like, hey, I want to buy the rights to this. So obviously, despite this already being a podcast and a book, this person saw it necessary to go ahead and create a TV show. So I am hoping that it will be worthwhile. And Keith Jesperson, the actual killer, is doing his best to withhold as much information as he can. This is all a game to him. He wants his daughter Melissa out there so he can be involved with her life, involved with this investigation, and perhaps feel some sense of importance again. He really likes the attention. I mean, he's in there in prison telling all his friends, yeah, it's only a matter of time till I'm on the Dr. Greg show. I mean, come on. It's very obviously a ploy for attention, less about actually doing the right thing and bringing this ninth victim to light. Unless he actually does feel guilty, there's somebody else on death row for it. But to me, if you've already killed 8 women, you probably don't have much of a guilty conscience at all. There are some pretty creepy moments here. I mean, at one point, Keith Jesperson says, there's still this little girl digging into his pockets for treasure, and every time a woman took her last breath, she got presents, and all of this daddy time stuff. I mean, imagine in retrospect looking back and realizing that your dad is actually giving you trinkets from somebody that he killed. Yikes. And speaking of the gifts, there's a trampoline that comes into play, which allows Melissa and Ivy to start investigating, figure out the timing of it all, and get to the bottom of who the victim was in the first place. And they did arrive at that pretty fast, which does make me think there's got to be much more beefiness to this case that we see coming. There is an element of some person out there that is working for Keith Jesperson who is potentially watching the family. And how is this guy going to come into play? I think that could be one of the big mysteries as well. Hearing some of the details surrounding these killings were pretty creepy. The fact that one of these victims had the scent of grapefruit, I thought that was weird. The graphic nature of hitting somebody over the head with an 11-inch wrench, dumping bodies under a bridge, and then going out and buying your daughter a trampoline. I mean, super creepy. And does the fact that he does give his daughter these gifts and whatnot, I mean, does he have somewhat of a guilty conscience trying to make up for it, as he's kind of saying, you know, if I can go do this, but then I have somebody that loves me this much at home, am I really a bad guy at heart? And I think all of these introspective questions and this ripple effect from the family are really the universal theme here within Happy Face as a whole. Now, the use of flashbacks is also very effective. We get a lot of peeks into memories that Melissa has, including memories of watching her dad telling her how to use duct tape, which he obviously used on his victims. I thought Missy, as her dad called her when she was younger, feeding her dad cereal while they're watching America's Most Wanted. I loved America's Most Wanted with John Walsh. It was one of my favorite shows growing up. That, Rescue 911, clearly I've always been into these types of shows. I appreciated that little nugget there. That felt like a very genuine moment within that flashback. I've also got to wonder, did Melissa have an inkling that her dad was a killer even before it was revealed that? I mean, he's talking about duct tape, how to not get your fingerprint on it, the fact that zip ties are better. I mean, as a 15-year-old, obviously you would never want to assume your dad's a killer. But when they move into the house where one of his victims was actually killed and Melissa's sleeping on the couch and sees up on the ceiling that there's a red stain, her dad's like, oh, it's just spaghetti sauce. In my mind, I'm thinking, why was spaghetti sauce splattered on the living room ceiling fan? I mean, kids are messy, people are messy. I just think that she probably did have some sort of an inkling and probably wasn't a super shock to her. And her life wasn't great as a child anyway, as we saw her and her brother sleeping in the basement of her mother's house. So again, these themes of family, the way you grow up, the experiences you have, and then discovering this very important piece of information and how it impacts you as an adult, and then how it also impacts your family. Now, when Melissa does end up appearing on the Dr. Greg show, she totally pulls a Cindy Brady there for a minute. And for all you young people who did not watch the Brady Bunch, there's a moment where she's all hyped up, she goes on a TV show, and then essentially freezes under the lights. I completely see why Melissa froze. This is a huge coming out moment for her. Everybody knows her as this woman, Melissa Moore. Nobody knows her as Melissa Jesperson, the daughter of a serial killer. And she makes it clear on the show she did not want to come on and humanize her dad. Instead, the focus for her is this man, Elijah, somebody who's on death row, that very clearly she wants to try to do the right thing and make up for all the misdeeds of her dad and try to get him off, which is definitely going to be more difficult than anticipated given the pushback from the DA and, again, the police department, because they don't want to have been wrong and put somebody on death row who's actually innocent. But especially in a conservative Texas, I mean, they don't want to have to ever look back and admit that there was wrongdoing or perhaps a lack of evidence in the investigation. So how was Keith Jesperson eventually caught? Well, he was questioned for the murder of a woman named Louise Nelson, who he was dating, who he thought was going to be a stepmom to his children. And after all, did not turn out to be that way, but it is crazy to see how this daughter, how this other woman can love a man who's a killer and just have no idea. You hear about it all the time. Oh, he was a good neighbor. He was a good friend. I never would have expected this man to ever do this. Well, it is obviously more common than we think, and we have seen within many of these true crime cases. And then too, the personal attack on Melissa when she's talking to this DA saying, well, hey, what if we can get Keith's daughter to testify? And then Calloway goes into this whole thing about how the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And, if the dad's a monster, who's to say the daughter wouldn't be? And try to exploit her and her issues if they were able to open up the case again and put her on the stand. That's pretty devastating for Melissa to hear, with him not knowing that she is actually his daughter. And the fact he's basically saying he'd eviscerate her and make her testimony useless. I mean, they're obviously trying to suppress all of this, which clearly it doesn't get suppressed and they must open the case back up, I'm assuming. Safe assumption, I think. I guess my biggest hope at this point is that they are able to crush these old white men in Texas who were wrong, who put someone in jail wrongfully, and get the right criminal convicted. And I talked a little bit about how this should feel a little bit less exploitative, given that we're not seeing the dead bodies, we're not seeing the graphic violence. But the exploitation for me comes in when Melissa's employer starts asking her these tough questions that I don't think were rehearsed or expected. Especially when he's digging into her again about, are you like this person who you're related to? Could you hurt somebody? And watching the real tears and reaction, again, it all plays into this theme about how the family is impacted more than anybody, even in some cases the victims, for cases like this. And at one point, Melissa has a quote, "What if I'm like him? I'm just scared that I came from him and he seemed so normal, then this side of him was so dark." And then she does say that she worries that she has it too sometimes, and that it makes her feel out of control, and perhaps her dad has always seen something inside of her like him. That's a tough pill to swallow and accept. Eventually, Dr. Greg does circle back and pay her some compliments like, you're smart, you're empathetic, you're kind, you're selfless. You are your father's daughter, but you're not like him and you never will be. And then Melissa replies, I'll never be him. And then there's the applause and then finally a sense of relief. It was a little awkward to watch this show, again, especially given how fast her turnaround time was from keeping this a big secret to going on a national talk show to talk about it. And at one point when Keith's in prison, he does say, I'm only doing it because it's the right thing to do. I'll save a man's life, so nobody can say that I'm all bad. But I still don't think that is his intent. I do think he's trying to use this situation to get closer to his daughter, potentially his grandchildren. And he's literally hanging the newspaper article about him on the wall. If this is not attention-seeking behavior, I don't know what is, and I do not buy for 1 second this man is just trying to be a good dude for once. And the relationship between Melissa and her mother at one point even says, if people find out who this is, that's all you are ever going to be, is the daughter of this serial killer. And in fact, she's made a whole brand of it in real life. I mean, she wrote a book, she's got a podcast, now there's a TV show. So I guess talk about turning lemons into lemonade. And if somebody's gonna make a buck on it, it may as well be the people who were so closely impacted and traumatized by a family member who they had no way of knowing was actually a cold-blooded killer. So some of the things the show does well, like I said, I think the flashbacks add a really good context and depth to the story, and seeing things from the perspective of Melissa at different ages and how those experiences have come to shape the woman she is now and the experience that she's currently going through. That scene where her mom was holding her and her dad is standing across this Chilliwack River kind of smiling at them, all these little things are coming back into play. She's replaying all of these memories in her head, trying to recollect if she could even garner more clues out of the situation. I mean, she was already able to present the Yellow Whiskey River bar guitar pick that they keep in bowls on that bar counter. What else is she going to remember that will hopefully help open this case up and provide more evidence to get Elijah off of death row? So episode 3 is called Was It Worth It? It airs next week, and the description reads, Melissa navigates the highs and lows of going public with her story. A new lead makes the team question Elijah's innocence as Keith gets thrown into solitary. Again, There are 6 more episodes in this series, which I assume will end up being a 1-season show, unless perhaps they do make it an anthology and title season 2 after a different killer. I'd imagine there's probably not 2 seasons worth of content, given that I'm already thinking this could have maybe worked better as a movie. So again, I think one of my biggest questions is the justification behind making this into a TV show with the 2 pre-existing pieces of IP. Is it even necessary? I mean, the story has been told. So what is different here that will get us as viewers really interested, invested, and coming back week after week, especially for people who've read the book or listened to the podcast? Now, I pose that question to you. If you have read the book, listened to the podcast, what is driving you to watch the show? Is this case so darn intriguing that you just have to get more of it? Or are you going in fresh like I am and are unfamiliar and just treating this as another TV series, a mystery that's building that you'll use the clues to try to solve and, hope we end up in a positive place? And just one other interesting statistic that was presented here that really encompasses the whole theme of this show. 5 out of 6 Americans are a victim to a violent crime in their life. And violent acts are like a rock dropped in water. If you stay silent, the ripples of trauma keep going, pulling everyone they touch underneath. So there are big consequences to all actions, even if you are not the perpetrator. And that thread will be woven throughout all 8 of these episodes. I think Annaleigh Ashford is good in this role. Dennis Quaid is fine as Keith Jesperson. I like Melissa's family. I love her husband. I think it will be very interesting to explore more into how her kids are dealing with this and how society is treating her and her family as a whole now that this is all out in the open. And perhaps they emerge as big heroes in the end. They can get Elijah off of death row, get her dad convicted of this, and maybe they even uncover more crimes along the way. I would love to know your thoughts. Drop in the comments. How do you feel about these first 2 episodes? Do you think this is strong enough? Are you drawn in by this mystery and you just have to keep coming back for more? I would love to know your thoughts. And I will be back to cover episode 3 next week. So be sure you like this video, hit that subscribe button for more TV talk as well. As I mentioned, I am finishing up this season 2 of Severance on Apple TV+. The finale drops tomorrow. So if you're watching that, definitely check that out. Also covering The White Lotus on HBO Max. And there are some other great shows coming this year, so stick with me for more TV talk. Thank you so much for tuning in. I will be back again soon. Media Melanie, clicking off.